This is section 4, lecture 4, still talking about foreign policy decision-making models. And in this lecture, we're going to be talking about the bureaucratic politics model. Let's look at the elements of this model. This comprises the leaders and the tops of bureaucracies in the executive branch. Within the context of the Cuban Missile Crisis, this would be those individuals in ExComm, the Executive Committee of the President. One of the elements here is that foreign policy outcomes or decisions are based on the outcome of the bargaining among these people. And among these people are not just their representations of their bureaucracies, but their own personal values. And so personality and strength plays a role in these small group decision-making circumstances. The national government is seen then as an arena for bureaucratic bargaining. And policy outcomes are not necessarily the optimal or best solutions to the problems at hand, but a result of bargaining, a result of who's a better arguer, a result of who has the president's ear more than other people in the room. And so the effective influence of individuals and their personalities and the influence they have on final decisions are elements of this model. If we look at the organizational concepts of this model, it includes the inner core of the executive branch. Who's going to have the most influence on a foreign policy decision? Those people in key positions, and the coalitions among these individuals. A second element is the representation of the bureaucracy by the individual. Here, the assumption is that if you are the leader of the State Department, you're going to represent its policies, its ideals. If you're the leader of the Defense Department, you're going to represent its policies, its ideals, so on and so forth. But the influence that you have on a particular decision is determined in part by the organization that you represent. And that's why I have in bold print here this quotation: where you sit determines where you stand. Where you sit, which bureaucracy you lead, determines which position, which idea, which set of advice or option you're supposed to represent. This is an interesting problem that is put forward, because oftentimes we see in U.S. Foreign policy circles or in U.S. Leadership, people rotate in and out of different bureaucracies. If we look at our recent history, we see then that former Secretary of Defense Robert Gates spent most of his career in the CIA. We see that former Secretary of State Colin Powell spent most of his career in the military. But the idea of the bureaucratic politics model is that the idea that you represent is supposed to determine not just where you stand, the policy that you take, but also your standing within the group. If we look at the National Security Council, the Secretary of the Treasury is a member. And in the foreign policy crisis that we looked at earlier, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Secretary of Treasury was in those meetings. But are you going to listen to the Secretary of Treasury, or are you going to listen to the Secretary of Defense more? Where you sit, which bureaucracy you're the head of, determines not just which policy you take, which stance you take, but it also determines where you stand among one another in the group. And this is what this third point leads to. There's fractured power within the group. What leads to effective influence or power over the final decision? Well, it depends on that individual's bargaining advantage, their role, their institutional backing, and their expertise. But it also is based on other personal abilities, the skill and will of you as an arguer, as a debater. Can you influence others more than they can influence you? Why are they going to listen to you? Or are they going to ignore you? So points 2 and 3 may go hand in hand if you think about that situation that I just raised. The Secretary of Treasury is going to be in the room, but are they really going to be listened to in the advice that they give, particularly if you're talking about a military crisis? The skill and will of that player may lead them to be listened to or ignored. Others' perceptions of the individual are also influential. Do you perceive the other person as knowing what they're talking about? Do you perceive them as strong, as you do perceive them as trustworthy? Well, this is going to lead you to accept their advice or reject their advice. And the outcome of this is fractured power of all individuals in the room. No player's power is sufficient enough to get their preferred policy across in whole. Problems and events are bound by time. And so then, if we talk about a foreign policy crisis, this is something, just by the definition of crisis, that is going to sneak up and surprise our decision makers. It is also something that's going to have to be addressed quickly. And I have here, deadlines demand decisions. And so then, who is going to have effective influence? Who's going to have a greater say or greater power over the final decision is based on time limitations and the advice that they have, their institutional backing, so on and so forth at the time. So for example, another modern or somewhat modern example. After September 11, 2001, the Bush administration, particularly President Bush, wanted to invade Afghanistan. And so then, the influence of invasion normally would fall to the Defense Department. But because the Defense Department is very large, because they weren't necessarily prepared to invade Afghanistan, there was going to be a lag time until a successful or large-scale, even small-scale special operations could get into Afghanistan. The CIA, however, claimed that they could have their special operations in Afghanistan very quickly. And so in that situation, the CIA had a leadership role where normally they may not have in the invasion of a country, because this problem or this event, this crisis, needed to be addressed quickly. Foreign policy decisions are seen as bargaining are seen as pieces only of the different pieces of advice, the different options that are put forward to a president. And so each of these points leads us away from fully rational decisions being made by our decision makers. Let's go back to the second point. Where you sit determines where you stand. If we look at former Secretary of State Colin Powell, where he sat at the head of the State Department determined where he stood. His job was to push diplomacy. And in the lead up to invasion of Iraq, in that debate and discussion that was going on in 2002 and 2003, this was his domain. This was his job. Because he was the Secretary of State, he was in charge of diplomacy. But if we look at his previous experience or expertise, it was military. And so then, the idea that you would have limitations on the options or limitations on the advice within the bureaucratic politics model comes in this situation. Should President Bush in that situation listen to the Secretary of State on military advice, or should he listen to the Secretary of Defense and the Joint Chiefs of Staff? In this particular situation, the Secretary of State used to be a member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And so then you get this confused and fractured power in this situation, particularly as it happens to be in that situation when Colin Powell was disagreeing with the military planning of then Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld. Another problem that comes into play: who has greater influence over others? The skill and will of the arguer. In that particular situation that I just mentioned, the build up to Iraq, it was Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld who, by a lot of different reports, had greater skill at arguing and the greater will to win in arguments than anybody else who was trying to get the ear of the president, even the generals who were tasked with planning. And so during this time, there were generals who were dismissed, those who resigned, because they disagreed with the planning of the Secretary of Defense. But his willingness to stick to his own ideas and his own policies and keep on pushing them led then to his success in winning in those negotiations. What he was arguing for was a smaller number of troops in the invasion force into Iraq, for example. Now, was that the best policy in hindsight? Well, many people argue no, because there weren't enough troops there to keep the peace after the successful invasion of Iraq and Iraq's government fell. Should he have been listened to, or should another military expert, Colin Powell, have been listened to? All of these bargaining problems stick a wrench into the idea that a rational decision, a fully fleshed out decision, might be made in these bargaining negotiations among a small group of actors.